So Jesmyn's going to start off with a reading, and then we'll jump into some questions. She might do another reading while we talk, but we'll have plenty of time for Q&A.
First of all, I'd like to say thank y'all for coming. Thank y'all for being here. I have to angle myself this way so you can hear me on the mic. I thought that I'd read two small sections from the beginning, right? So from the first chapter, which is Jojo's chapter. Jojo is one of the main protagonists of the novel. He's a 13-year-old mixed race boy growing up on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. His mom she's named Leonie. She's somewhat absent. Because she's absent, she's also a drug addict. He's being raised by his mother's father and his mother's mother, right? So his maternal grandparents, Pop and Ma'am. Jojo has a 2-year-old little sister. Her name is Michaela, but they call her Kayla for short, who he takes care of often, right? So the first bit that I'm going to read is from his chapter. The second bit that I'll read is from Leonie, his mother's chapter, and much of it concerns her brother, Given. He was her older brother, and he died when they were teenagers. I think that's all I need to tell you. Oh, also, Jojo, this book has a bit of magic in it, magical realism. Jojo he can hear things, right? So when he's around animals, he can understand them. He feels like he can understand what they are saying to him. So that's one of a couple of different magical elements in the book. So first, this is Jojo. Usually the singing is my favorite part of my birthday because the candles make everything look gold and they shine in Mam's and Pop's faces and make them look young as Leonie and Michael. Whenever they sing to me, they smile. I think it's Kayla's favorite part too because she sings stutteringly along. Kayla's making me hold her because she cried and pushed at Leonie's collarbone and reached for me until Leonie frowned and held her out to me, said, "Here." But this year, the song is not my favorite part of my birthday because instead of being in the kitchen, we're all crowded into Mam's room and Leonie's holding the cake like she held Kayla earlier, out and away from her chest like she gonna drop it. Mam's awake but doesn't really look awake, her eyes half open, unfocused, looking past me and Leonie and Kayla and Pop. Even though Mam's sweating, her skin looks pale and dry, like a muddy puddle dried to nothing after weeks of no rain in the summer. And there's a mosquito buzzing around my head, dipping into my ear, veering out, teasing to bite. When the happy birthday song starts, it's only Leonie. She has a pretty voice, the kind of voice that sounds good singing low, but sort of cracks on the high notes. Pop is not singing. He never sings. When I was younger, I didn't know because I'd have a whole family singing to me, Ma'am, Leonie, and Michael. But this year, when Ma'am can't sing because she's sick, and Kayla makes up words to the melody, and Michael's gone, I know Pop isn't singing because he's just moving his lips, lip syncing, and there's no noise coming out. Leonie's voice cracks on Dear Joseph, and the light from the 13 candles is orange. No one but Kayla looks young. Pop is standing too far out of the light. Ma'am's eyes have closed to slits in her chalky face, and Leonie's teeth look black at the seams. There's no happiness here. Happy birthday, Jojo, Pop says, but he's not looking at me when he says it. He's looking at Ma'am, at her hands loose and open at her sides, palms up like something dead. I lean forward to blow out my candles, but the phone rings and Leonie jumps, so the cake jumps with her. The flames waver and feel hotter under my chin. Pearls of wax drip onto the baby shoes. Leonie turns away from me with the cake, looking to the kitchen, to the phone on the counter. You gonna let the boy blow out his candles, Leonie? Pop asks. Might be Michael, Leonie says. And then there is no cake, because Leonie's taken it with her to the kitchen, set it on the counter next to the black corded phone. The flames are eating the wax. Kayla shrieks and throws her head back. So I follow Leonie into the kitchen to my cake, and Kayla smiles. She's reaching for the fire. The mosquito that was in Ma'am's room has followed us, and he's buzzing around my head, talking about me like I'm a candle or a cake. So warm and delicious. I swat him away. Hello? Leonie says. I grab Kayla's arm and lean into the flames. She struggles, transfixed. Yes, Leonie says. I blow. Baby, Leonie says. Half the candles gutter out. This week, Leonie says. The other half eating wax to the nub. You sure? Leonie says. I blow again, and the cake goes dark. The mosquito lands on my head. So scrumptious, he says, and bites. I swat him, and my palm comes away smeared with blood. Kayla reaches. We'll be there, Leonie says. Kayla has a handful of frosting, and her nose is running. Her blonde afro curls high. She sticks her fingers in her mouth, and I wipe. Easy, baby, easy. Michael is an animal on the other end of the telephone, behind a fortress of concrete and bars, his voice traveling over miles of wire and listing sun-bleached power poles. I know what he is saying, like the birds I hear honking and flying south in the winter, like any other animal. I'm coming home. So this next section is written from Leonie's point of view, and it starts the night before Jojo's birthday. She's sort of telling the story of what she did the night before Jojo turned 13. Last night, he smiled at me, this given not given, this given that's been dead 15 years now, this given that came to me every time I snorted a line, every time I popped a pill. He sat in one of the 2 empty chairs at the table with us and leaned forward and rested his elbows on the table. He was watching me, like always. He had Mama's face. That much, huh? Misty sucked snot up her nose. Yep, I said. Given rubbed the dome of his shaved head, and I saw other differences between the living and this chemical figment. Given not given didn't breathe right. He never breathed at all. He wore a black shirt, and it was a still, mosquito-ridden pool. What if Michael's different? Misty said. He won't be, I said. Misty threw a wadded up paper towel she'd been using to clean the table. What you looking at? She said. Nothing, I said. Bullshit, she said. Don't nobody sit and stare for that long on something this clean without looking at something. Misty waved her hand at the Coke and winked at me. She tattooed her boyfriend's initials on her ring finger, and for a second, it looked like letters, and then bugs, and then letters again. Her boyfriend was black, and this loving across color lines was one of the reasons we became friends so quickly. She often told me that as far as she was concerned, they were already married. Said she needed him because her mother didn't give a shit about her. Misty told me once that she got her period in 5th grade when she was 10 years old, and because she didn't realize what was happening to her, her body betraying her, she walked around half the day with a bloody spot spreading like an oil stain on the back of her pants. Her mother beat her in the parking lot of the school. She was so embarrassed. The principal called the cops. Just one of the many ways I disappointed her, Misty said. I was feeling it, I said. You know how I know you lie, Misty said. How? You get dead still. People's always moving all the time when they speak, when they quiet, even when they sleep. Looking off, looking at you, smiling, frowning, all of that. When you lie, you get dead still. Blank face, arms limp, like a fucking corpse. I ain't never seen nothing like it. I shrugged. Given not given shrugs. She ain't lying, he mouths. You ever see things? I say. It's out my mouth before I have a chance to think it. But at the moment, she's my best friend. She's my only friend. What you mean? Misty says. When you on. I waved my hand like she waved hers moments before at the coat, which was now just a little sorry pile of dust on the table, enough for 2 or 3 lines more. That's what it is? You seeing shit? Misty said. Just lines like neon lights or something in the air, I said. Nice try. You try to twitch your hands and everything. Now what you really seeing? Misty says. I wanted to punch her in her face. I told you, I said. Yeah, you lied again, she said. But I knew this was her cottage, and when it all came down to it, I'm black and she's white, and if someone heard us tussling and decided to call the cops, I'd be the one going to jail, not her, best friend and all. Given, I said. More like a whisper than anything, and Given leaned forward to hear me. Slid his hand across the table, his big-knuckled, slim-boned hand toward mine, like he wanted to support me, like he could be flesh and blood, like he could grab my hand and lead me out of there, like we could go home. Misty looked like she ate something sour. She leaned forward and sniffed another line. I ain't an expert or nothing, but I'm pretty sure you ain't supposed to be seeing nothing on this shit, she said. She leaned back in her chair, grabbed her hair in a great sheaf, and tossed it over her back. Bishop loves it, she'd said of her boyfriend once. Can't keep his hands out of it. It was one of the things she did that she was never conscious of, playing with her hair, always unaware of the ease of it, the way it caught all the light, the self-satisfied beauty of it. I hated her hair. Acid, yeah, she continued. Maybe even meth, but this, no. Given, not given frowned, mimicked her girly hair flip and mouthed, what the fuck does she know? His left hand was still on the table. I could not reach out to it, even though everything in me wanted to do so, to feel his skin, his flesh, his dry, hard hands. When we were coming up, I couldn't count how many times he fought for us on the bus, in school, in the neighborhood when kids taunted me about how Pop looked like a scarecrow, how Mama was a witch, how I looked just like Pop, like a burnt stick, raggedly clothed. My stomach turned like an animal in its burrow, again and again, seeking comfort and warmth before sleep. I lit a cigarette. No shit, I said. Thank you.
What struck me early on in the reading was that this is set in present time, but it felt like the past. Did you have that feeling as you were writing? I mean, there were things like cell phones. I was like, okay, wait, what decade are we in? But there was technology, mm-hmm. So I knew that we were in present time.
I feel like one of the things that I'm always, I feel like one of the ideas that I'm always thinking about and always obsessing over whenever I'm writing, even when I'm writing fiction and when I'm writing creative nonfiction too, is I'm always thinking about time, right? And I'm thinking about the past and the present and how, at least the way that I understand it in the South, right? That time it's not a linear thing, right? That everything seems to be happening at the same time, and that the past, bears so heavily on the present, even though I feel like we live in a culture that chooses not to think about time in that way, and we just sort of like assume. I think that so many people just sort of assume that what happened in the past happened in the past and it has no bearing on the present. And I just feel like in the South, that, especially in the South, that is not the case, and that the past lives very closely with us. And so I think that, that I was trying to depict that in the book, right? And trying to, find my way to like a better understanding of time in the book, because I feel like so much about the characters' past, their past in Parchment Prison, right? Jim Crow, right? The history of slavery. I feel like so much of that, reverberates into the present and like lives with the characters in the present. So I think that perhaps that's a reason why the book has that quality, and that the story has that quality where you're not really sure where you are in time, because my idea was that it's all happening right now.
And ghosts are literal and figurative in the book. The ghosts of dead relatives, the ghost of your decisions. And I very much felt the ghost of slavery and Jim Crow throughout, even though no one, I don't think, ever uttered the phrase Jim Crow.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I didn't think that I was writing a ghost story when I first began writing the rough draft of the novel. I thought, this is going to be about a road trip, right? This family is going to take a road trip, and they're going to head north, deeper into Mississippi, right? What people deeper into, they're going to head towards the Delta, right? And when people think about Mississippi and they think about the heart of Mississippi, they think about the Delta, right? And so I was like, okay, they'll head north into the Delta, and things will be sort of, things will be like crazy and awful in some ways and strange. Who knows what might happen? But I just thought it was a road trip. And then when I began like researching and reading more about Parchment Prison Farm, which is, the Mississippi State Penitentiary, and reading more about just like the history of Mississippi and the history of that place, the history of the Delta, that's when I realized that there would be ghosts in this, right? And I think that when I read about kids like Richie, right? When I read that there are actual 12 and 13-year-olds in the 1940s, 50s, who were charged with petty crimes like vagrancy or like stealing really small things, and then sentenced to Parchment Prison Farm to basically be tortured and to die, right? Because, that farm, it's such a brutal system, right? The inmates were basically slaves.
So I had to stop reading the book and like do a quick Google search on Parchment. I was like, does this place exist?
Yeah.
Is this, imaginative of someplace else? And so I went down a little bit of the rabbit hole of the history. And like, is this a place that you knew those ghosts growing up? Like, how much did you know about Parchment versus how much you had to research? So Pop, who Jojo's grandfather, he spent time in Parchment, and then this road trip is Leonie and Jojo, Kayla and her friend Misty driving there to get Michael, her boyfriend, their father, out of Parchment. He's being released.
I knew about Parchment when I was growing up. Everybody that I knew did. We knew that it was like the big prison in Mississippi. I think in the same way that a lot of people that grow up in Louisiana and who are black and poor know about Angola, you know what I'm saying? And so we knew about Parchment Prison. I didn't know much about it beyond it was a bad place and you didn't want to end up there. So when I decided that Michael, that the white father, right, in the family would begin the book in Parchment, and that Leonie and Jojo and Kayla and Leonie's friend Misty would go pick him up, I thought, okay, I really don't know anything about, Parchment beyond this boogeyman, right, that I grew up with. And so I thought, okay, I need to research. And so that's when I began to look for books that were about Parchment. And then that's when I learned, all of the stuff about Parchment. And a lot of it, shows up in this book, right? That there's a character, like Richie, who is exemplary of one of these, little kids, right, that were sent there.
For stealing food for his
stealing
hungry
food.
brother and sisters.
Yeah.
And the Mississippi Freedom Riders were taken to Parchment, and this is when they were psychologically tortured. It was told, don't hurt them, but play mind games with them.
Yeah.
I think I read in an interview that you also read The Half Has Never Been Told about slavery and the economy. How did that factor into your writing process, your researching process?
The funny thing is that I actually read The Half Has Never Been Told for the book for the next novel that I am in the very beginning stages of working on. So I can't tell you much about it. But yeah, I actually read, so I read that book for, so that I could write the next book that I'm working on. But now, I keep talking about it to everyone who asks me about what I'm reading because it's an amazing book, I feel like. And because, again, I knew nothing. My high school education failed me in some ways, I think, because I learned nothing about slavery when I was in school.
Was it called, when you were in school, the War of Northern Aggression?
Exactly.
Not the Civil War?
Exactly. Probably. I learned nothing about slavery. And so I wanted to write this book that's set in New Orleans at the height of the domestic slave trade. And then I realized, okay, I read a couple different books about slave markets, about New Orleans, about maroons, so escaped slaves who built communities. And then I thought, okay, I'm ready. But then I realized I know nothing about slavery. So that's when I started reading that book. And it blew my mind. It's an amazing book. If you haven't read it, you should definitely read it because, it's the kind of book that will change the way that you perceive the world, I think. The Half Has Never Been Told, and it's by Edward Baptist.
Which character came to you first?
Jojo. I always, when I'm casting about for novel ideas, I tend to think in questions. I know that sounds odd, but when
Not for a reporter.
Yeah. You see, when an idea comes to me, it's always a question. So, say for Salvage the Bones, the question was, so what would it be like for a teenage girl growing up in a world full of men? And that was the question that inspired Salvage the Bones. And then with Sing Unburied Sing, it was like, okay, what would it be like for, a 13, year-old mixed race boy growing up in the modern South, right? And I, do the little quotation marks when I say modern South because again, right, if we talk about the past and the present, if we talk about history, like I feel like, the South as it is now in 2017, it's a different place from the South that I grew up in the 80s and in the early 90s, but in some ways. But in other ways, in big ways, it's still the same place, right? And I think in the big ways, it's still the same place that it was, in 1970, in 1960, in 1950, and 40, and 30, and on back. So that's the question that sort of was the spark for the book. And so his voice, even when I was writing like really unsuccessful chapters, which I was, of this novel back in 2009 that I just had to throw away because they were so bad, like he was the clearest character for me. His was the voice that I heard when I sat down in front of the computer to write. There's something about him, like I feel like he wanted to tell me this story.
Talk about your decision to write about a mixed race family.
I think it's, like I was just said a second ago, like I think that the South of 2017 is very different from the South that I grew up in the 80s and the 90s. And I think one of the ways that it's different is that there are more interracial families now. And it doesn't seem, there's not as much of a, I feel like a stigma or social stigma, right? The kind that there would have been back in the 80s, in the early 90s. But, at the same time, I thought, I can see, and this is just from like what I've seen in my own community and amongst my own friends, right, some of them, right, who are in interracial relationships and have, mixed race kids, like, some of these kids are not accepted by the white side of their family, right? Some of these kids, that there's real resistance, on the part of, some of the like white family members when they bought their, black girlfriend's home or, vice versa. Like I've seen some resistance, and so I thought that that situation, right? So where this 13-year-old mixed race kid, is trying to figure out who he is in the world, right? And who, and where he fits and what he's trying to figure out, like how the world will perceive him, right? But in his own family, there's already, I think the larger like spectacles of race and racism and prejudice, like they're rearing their heads in like very ugly, very personal, very immediate ways. And so I thought that would be a situation that's ripe for drama.
And Jojo, I mean, all 13-year-olds are coming of age and figuring out their place. I never got the sense that he was struggling with any racial identity or figuring out who am I. Mm-hmm. It was like, he calls his father by his first name, well, and his mother, because there isn't, the kind of tender parental relationship. And then in scenes with Michael's father, those are moments where, okay, what decade are we in? Because it was such a, not we don't approve of this, but, violent reaction to having Black grandchildren.
Yeah, I feel like Jojo, in many ways, when I think about Jojo's family, in my early drafts of the book, Jojo's mother was white and his father was black. And those early chapters, those early drafts that didn't work, I think they didn't work because Jojo, as I began to understand him, was like firmly rooted in, I think, like the black experience. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think that the way that he's oriented in the world, he so closely identifies with pop, right? Mm-hmm. That I felt like, you know, that something in me knew, even though I didn't have a clear idea of who Pop was, that an older black man would be really important to Jojo and would be really important to his idea of, or his understanding of who he is and of who he might be and of how he should walk in the world. And so early on, like, I had to, in order to write a successful, you know, first chapter, second chapter, and then on into the first rough draft, like I had to figure out that that the family that was raising him, right, the family that he was with all the time, that family was black, and it worked, you know, for his mom and for his mother's people to be black.
I'm sure it probably annoys you as a writer when people say, well, I didn't like that character, as if characters in books have to all be liked. But Leonie, the mother, is pretty unlikable. And, you know, in some ways she's trying, but she just makes a series of just bad decisions as an individual, but also as a mom. Even though I do think that you give her some humanity at the same time, but what was that like writing her?
I disliked her too at first, and I was having a really hard time writing her because I disliked her, because I realized as I worked that I tend to love all my characters, right? And in the beginning I was not loving her.
So is this the first character you've ever written who you didn't like?
Well, it took a while for the dislike to turn into something else, to evolve into something else. And I think that the way that it evolved into something else, so the reason I disliked her was because she was so awful to her children, right? In the ways that she like mistreats them and abuses them and neglects them, that it was really hard for me to feel sympathy for her. And so because I couldn't understand why she was being such an awful person to her children, and specifically to Jojo. And so I realized that I couldn't continue to write her character without that sense of sympathy. So I had to figure out what was at the root of her behavior, right? Like, what was making her so awful to her children? I had to figure out her motivation. And so at that time, I didn't know whether or not the phantom Given was an actual ghost, or whether he was like a hallucination. In early drafts, actually, it wasn't even Given that was appearing to her. It was actually like a phantom of Michael. And that really wasn't working, because all that shows is that, you know, she's like wildly in love with this guy and she misses him, right? But then once I discovered that was like a phantom of her brother, and then I you know, wrote more of the book, and I thought about who Given was, and I discovered who Given was and how he died, and who he was to Leonie and the relationship that they had. Then I felt like I understood her motivation, because I understood that she's never really attempted to confront her grief, right? And that she's sort of carrying this pain around with her, and that pain is so great that she can't see past it to be the kind of mother, to be less selfish, right? And to be the kind of mother that she needs to be to her children, right? And so once I discovered that, then I could feel for her, you know. Then I felt some sympathy for her. Then I actually felt really bad for her, because I feel like in some ways she knows that she's failing, and yet she just can't she can't move beyond herself and she can't get it together, right? Because she's just like wallowing in this loss and in this grief, right? And it's not just about her, the loss of her brother, it's also about the imminent loss of her mother. It's about the way that she feels like her father, that she's lost her father in some ways. It's the way that she, at the beginning of the book, right, she's lost Michael in a way, they've been separated. So she's just like all wrapped up and bound by loss, and she can't see beyond that. So once I understood that and understood like the pain at the heart of her, then and then I loved her.
I was surprised to see meth in the book. Can you? Black people using meth.
So the small town that I come from, that I model, the town of Bois Sauvage, which is the town that I write about in all my books, in my fiction. That the town of Bois Sauvage is modeled in some ways, is modeled on the small town that I'm from, called DeLille. And, for years, like when I was growing up, I saw the crack epidemic, right, hit. I mean, my town is a small town in rural Mississippi, yet the crack epidemic, it happened there too. And it's different because, it happened in rural Mississippi, but still. So during the late 80s into the early 90s, that, we definitely had a crack epidemic. Many people in my family, many people in my community struggled with addiction for years. Some of them overcame it, a lot of them didn't, right? A lot of them were still struggling with addiction, up until, say, 2 years ago. And then around 2 years ago, then meth all of a sudden was like everywhere. And I don't know where it came from. I don't know how it happened, but suddenly so many of the people that I know in my community and my family who were struggling with crack addiction had now like switched drugs, and they were all now, smoking meth and dealing with meth. And so I think that, in part, like I wanted the book to reflect that, because I remember like reading about the meth epidemic years, 5-10 years ago, right? And dreading, like knowing that it's coming, right? I mean, we're slow in Mississippi, in rural Mississippi, we're slow to get everything, but I knew it was coming. And so now, like to see it come and to see it replace crack in some ways, and to see how, meth as a drug, it's just different, it does, a number on you psychologically. And now so many people that I know, that are using it are now, dealing with that. It's just, so I wanted my work to be truthful, I think, to what I see the people in my community struggling with. And so that's why I wanted to write about it.
As I was reading, I was thinking the whole book was going to be told from Jojo's perspective, and then you alternate. So you read from Leonie earlier. Why did you decide to have alternative voices narrate?
I think there were a couple different reasons. One, I knew I wanted Jojo to speak and to narrate chapters from the very beginning, because I wanted him, this little 13-year-old kid, like I wanted him to have voice. I wanted him to have agency. I wanted him to be able to tell his story. But at the same time, like when I was thinking about Leonie and thinking about his mother, and thinking about so much of what she struggles with, and thinking about how people like her so often are not allowed to tell their stories, I wanted to give her an opportunity to do so. I wanted to give her voice. I wanted to give her agency. I wanted her to be able to, communicate to the reader like how she understands the world and how she sees the world. And so for that reason, I wanted to give her the opportunity, to narrate certain chapters as well. And in some ways, as a writer, writers are always growing. We're always maturing. We're always, working like to better ourselves, I think, and to better our work. And in some ways, I think writing a novel with alternating narrators was my way of challenging myself as a writer. It's sort of like I set the task for myself just to see if I could pull it off, if I could do it. Because it's difficult to write something like that, right? Because you have to think about, okay, so what does this character know? What do they think they know that they actually don't, that they're wrong about? When should they tell when should they tell these things that they think they know? Like in what order, right? And how is that going to contrast with what the other characters are saying, right? So it can be a tricky thing to do.
But I found myself looking for, like, once I got into that rhythm, it's like, okay, so this is, why was Jojo so upset at his mother for doing this? Mm-hmm. And then you read her, like, it was almost like the reader had the experience what the characters were doing twice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because like you'll see the situation say when they, there's a moment in the book when they get pulled over, when they're on the road and then they get pulled over by policemen. And so in that moment, we're able to see it from Leonie's perspective. And then later, we get to see it from Jojo's perspective, and we get to see like how different that experience is for both of them, right? So on one hand, Leonie feels powerless when it's happening, and I think she feels a little guilty because she feels like it's her fault, right? And then Jojo's experience of that same situation, he doesn't feel any guilt. He feels powerless too, and there's so much terror and
he's
dread.
Angry at his mother, actually.
Yeah, for putting him in that situation. And so I just think, it was a lovely thing. It was a lovely like structure, I think, for me to explore because I think it allowed me to give both characters such depth, right, and understanding, and and I don't know. Maybe I'll do it again in the future. Who knows?
Did that process help you grow to love Leonie?
I think so. I mean, she, okay, let me start over again. I understand more about my characters
than we read?
No, well, maybe, but as I get deeper and deeper into the novel, I understand more about them, right? So I'm not the type of, I know that some writers will write, I've encountered this before, but some writers will write like, entire pages, right, of like information about each, character, right, background, and I don't do that, right? So like my understanding of who the characters are at the beginning of a novel is sort of shallow, right? And as I write, that's how I begin to understand who they are and what they want and how they perceive the world and how they understand themselves. And so like my understanding of who the characters are, changes as my understanding as I get like deeper into a novel. But I feel like the same holds true also for whatever like the big, whatever the overarching ideas of the novel are, right? My understanding of what the novel is about, that changes as I get deeper into.
I mean, that sounds so incredibly difficult. I've heard writers say the opposite. Like they write these long biographies with so much information that never makes it into the book, just so they have this clear vision of who the person is. Yeah. And so for you not to do that and still be able to write very, very fleshed out characters. But in the writing process, does that mean you, assuming that you're writing in order, you might not, but do you go back and revise, like once you've determine, okay, I've taken this journey with this character and I have this full understanding. Does that require any revisions outside of all writing is rewriting?
Yes, plenty of revision. I mean, I think, yes. Because I feel like I tried to write from outlines before, but I feel like, again, like my understanding of who the characters are at the beginning, even if I write an outline, it always changes as I'm writing the book. I feel like the characters begin to surprise me, that they do things that I don't expect them to do, that that just the process of like writing the book, writing about these characters, writing about the world that they're in, that opens them up, that they're able to assume life and like take on a life of their own. So therefore, things that I thought that I knew about them at the beginning, like those things don't always hold true as I write more and more and more. And so, especially once, my friends who are readers I send them a draft of the book and they give me feedback. And then after I've revised 1,000,000 times, then I send it to my editor and she tells, she gives me feedback as well. Like once I do all that and then I'm going back in and doing even more revision, like some of their feedback is always, like they're asking me questions about the characters, right? They're asking me to clarify things, to develop things. And so my understanding of like who the characters are and of what they're capable of and of what they will do, I feel like it's always changing.
And talk some more about your writing process, like when things come to you, are you just sitting looking at a blank wall? Are you listening to music? Like how... are you engaged with the world, or are you more of a writer who's in solitude?
I am more of a solitary writer. I can only listen to music when I'm thinking about ideas. So when I'm like casting about for ideas, for novel ideas, or if I'm thinking about the characters or thinking about the situation. But when I finally sit down to write, I can't listen to music at all, because I feel like the musicality of the prose is really important to me, right? The rhythm of the sentences, the rhythm of the lines, the rhythm of the paragraphs, and I can't hear that if music is playing in the background. So I'm actually I don't work well in cafes or in like crowded places. I have to work somewhere that's fairly quiet. I know for some writers that noise will become background noise, but for me it doesn't, unfortunately. So it has to be really quiet, and then I can sort of sink into the world that I'm writing about. And I tend to approach writing as, or at least I try to approach writing as part of my routine, right? So I try to write for at least 2 hours a day, 5 days a week.
Is there a certain time, or does that matter?
I mean, since I've had kids, that time varies. I mean, now I'm naturally a night owl. I stay up really late, unfortunately. But now that I have kids, like I still stay up, but I'm like exhausted, so I can't think and work during that time. And so I try to get up earlier. Fortunately, I don't have kids that like to wake up at like 5:30 in the morning. My kids wake up around 8:30, and so
That's really nice.
Yeah, I can get up earlier than them, and I can work. And then, of course, when they're in preschool, then that's great, because on days when I don't have to drive into Tulane and teach, then I have most of the morning to devote to writing. So then I can work for more than 2 hours, which is really nice. I can work for like 4.
If you could read the section from Leonie, I mean, that's actually where I felt all that rhythm. I reread that section a few times because it was just so, it did have a cadence or a musical quality to it.
Okay. So the section that Natalie is asking me to read is from Leonie's, one of Leonie's chapters. It's in the middle of the book, It's a part where Leonie has discovered that she's a teenager. This is a flashback. She's a teenager. She's discovered that she's pregnant, and she's realized that she has to tell her mom, right? And so she goes up to talk to, she works up the courage to talk to her mom, to tell her mom that she is pregnant. Her mother, which I don't think I've said this yet, but her mother has something of a gift. She's a voodoo or hoodoo practitioner. She practices herbal medicine. She is able to, her gift allows her to understand why people are sick and what she can do to help them. So she's a bit of a psychic gift, I guess.
And she's Catholic,
yes,
right?
and she's Catholic.
Like all those things were, yeah.
Yes. And so there's a bit in here where one of the characters speaks a little French, and I am going to butcher it. So I'm just warning you in advance. Even though I've taken French forever, but I still cannot speak it. Here you come. Been singing for weeks, Mama said. Mama? I said. Mama stepped down from the pine step stool Pop had built her. He'd carved her name into the top of it. The letters looked like wisps of smoke. Philomen. It had been her Mother's Day present years before. When I was so little, the only help I could give was to scratch a little star, 4 lines crossed at the middle on the side of her name. And Given had carved a rose that looked like a muddy puddle, now worn smooth by Mama's feet. I was wondering how long it was going to take you to build up the nerve to tell me, she said, the stool tucked under her arm like she would put it away. But instead of walking to the kitchen, she sat on the sofa and let the step stool hang over her legs across her lap. Ma'am? I asked. Thunder boomed. I felt hot around the neck and armpits, like someone had splashed hot grease across my face and chest. I sat down. You're pregnant, Mama said. I saw 2 weeks ago. She reached across the wood in her lap and touched me then, not with the pitiless hand of the lightning, but with her dry, warm hands, soft under the skin. She worked hard, just a second of a touch on my shoulder, like she had found a piece of lint there and was brushing it off. I surprised myself and curled into it, leaning forward, put my head on the wood while her hand rubbed circles on my back. I was crying. I'm sorry, I said, the wood hard against my mouth, unyielding, wetting with my tears. Mama leaned over me. No room for sorries now, baby. She grabbed me by the shoulders, pulled me up to look at my face. What you want to do? What you mean? I said. The closest abortion clinic was in New Orleans. One of the more well-off girls in my school whose daddy was a lawyer had taken her after she'd gotten pregnant, so I knew it was there and it was expensive. I thought we had no money for that. I was right. Mama gestured at the hanging plants, the listing jungle above our heads, bristling in the cool electric air. I could give you something, she said. She let the end of the sentence trail off, disappear. She looked at me like I was a smudged book she was having trouble reading and cleared her throat. It was one of the first things I learned how to do in my training. It's the one tea I never have enough of. She touched my knee again. She'd found another piece of lint. She leaned back again and her culotte stretched tight across her knees. Years later, that's where she'd first start feeling the pain from the cancer, in her knees. Then it moved up to her hips, her waist, her spine, to her skull. It was a snake slithering along her bones. Sometimes I think back to that day, to her sitting on the sofa, giving me those little touches that didn't want to turn me one way or the other, even though she wanted Jojo, I think, because her grief for Given was hungry for life. Sometimes I wonder if the cancer was sitting there with us in that moment too, if it was another egg, a yellow egg knit of sorrow, bearing the shape of bullet holes, wiggling in the marrow of her bones. That day, she was wearing a blouse she'd sewn herself from a print full of pale yellow flowers. Roses look like. You want this, baby, Leonie? A whip crack of lightning lit the house, and I jumped as the thunder boomed. I choked and coughed. Mama patted my back. The humidity made her hair alive around her face, tendrils of it standing up and curling away from her buttery scalp. The lightning cracked again, this time like it was right on top of us, feet away from arcing through the house, and her skin was white as stone and her hair waving, and I thought about the Medusa I'd seen in an old movie when I was younger, monstrous and green-scaled, and I thought, that's not it at all. She was as beautiful as Mama, That's how she froze those men, with the shock of seeing something so perfect and fierce in the world. Yeah, Mama, I said. It still twists something in me to think of that. The fact that I hesitated, that I looked at my mama's face in that light and felt myself wrestle with wanting to be a mother, with wanting to bear a baby into the world, to carry it throughout life. The way we were sitting on that sofa, knees tight, backs curved, heads low, made me think of mirrors and of how I'd want it to be a different kind of woman, how I'd want it to move somewhere far away, go west to California, probably with Michael. He talked about moving west and working as a welder all the time. A baby would make that harder. Mama looked at me and she wasn't stoned no more. Her eyes were crumpled and her mouth crooked, and that told me she knew exactly what I was thinking, and I worried that she could read minds too, that she would see me shying away from who she was. But then I thought of Michael, of how happy he would be, of how I would have a piece of him with me always, and that unease melted like lard in a cast iron pot. I do. I wish you would have finished school first, Mama said. Another piece of lint, this time on my hair at the crown of my head. But this is now, and we do what we do. She smiled then, a thin line, no teeth, and I leaned forward and put my head in her lap again, and she ran her hands up and down my spine, over my shoulder blades, pressed in on the base of my neck, all the while shushing like a stream, like she'd taken all the water pouring on the outside world into her, and she was sending it out in a trickle to soothe me. Je suis la fille de l'océan, la fille des ondes, la fille de l'écume, Mama muttered, and I knew she was calling on Our Lady of Regla, on the star of the sea, that she was invoking Yamaya, the goddess of the ocean and salt water, with her shushing and her words, and that she was holding me like the goddess, her arms all the life-giving waters of the world.
Wow.